Okay, good morning to everyone, first of all. So just trying to welcome everyone and thanks for being here on time to everyone. We know that it's early and
This meeting is being recorded.
some of you were also able to enjoy last night in Santa Marta and the beautiful nightlife and so on. So we really appreciate those of you who managed to be here in time. And we apologize also that we're running a tiny bit late, but I think it's still totally fine. So I'm just trying to speak a bit longer also at the beginning to see a bit if the translation system is working. We will have this session half in Spanish, half in English. I will be speaking in Spanish and English, sorry. Lo siento. I will be speaking in English, and Wangũi is speaking in English, and Eduardo will be speaking in Spanish. And the entire conversation among us will be then a mixture of Spanish and English. Your question can be posed in Spanish and in English. Please be aware that you have to wait for us to bring you the microphone so that you can speak, because the translators then have to listen to you and then to translate simultaneously. Those of you that still need the link for the translation service, please raise your hands so that we can go around showing you the QR code. So those of you that are not fluent in Spanish and English, they will need it. So therefore, this is, I think, just the most important information. We are also streaming this event live in Spanish and English for people that cannot make it to be here, as we are, especially within TRAJECTS, trying to promote a North-South-South exchange, especially within the European continent, the Latin American continent, and the African continent. So when I'm saying good morning to everybody who's here now in Santa Marta in Colombia at the moment, it means I'm actually saying good afternoon to people on the African continent and to people in Europe. So therefore, also this is the reason why we're translating things, to enable more people from different regions to be present. Hoping that more people are now able to also listen to us, I just also want to use the chance to introduce myself. My name is Wangũi. I'm professor at the University of Flensburg, and I'm also principal investigator and a coordinator of the so-called TRAJECTS project, which is a DID-financed capacity building project in Colombia, South Africa, and Germany. And we especially try to promote a North-South-South exchange and to enable people from Colombia and people from South Africa to exchange on their different experiences, because we believe that there's a lot that people can learn from another. And in many cases, people can learn more from other global South countries than from us from the global North. However, we from the global North, coming from a privileged position, also do have sometimes the resources and the possibilities to enable this exchange. And this is also how I consider my role to be, as a moderator, as a facilitator of this dialogue. We will be talking about different views on just transition, different knowledges existing in different continents. And me coming from the global North will start basically by just giving a very brief intro on some topics. But then I want to give especially the floor to Eduardo and Wangũi to basically share their experiences and their knowledge from their own work, as well as from basically the scholars and individual people and participants that they have been inspired by. So therefore, this is basically just how I want to kick off. I hope that still everybody can hear me. Once again, there are still people running around with the QR codes assisting on this. So therefore, these are just some opening remarks. Starting off with this, I just want to keep it very short, and I just basically want to start off with saying that we are talking about a so-called just transition. And I think there's a lot of different ways of framing it, of what the topic means, and also sometimes what the words exactly should be. Also, some people speak of transition, others speak of transformation, sometimes speak the words like justice, inclusive, fair. It depends sometimes a lot on the different languages, also which words they use, and the different backgrounds, on the different ethnographic experiences, and how far they consider which people or nature to be also more at the center of this understanding of a transition. And therefore, I wanted to take off, coming with my background, basically from the experiences where I have heard about these terminologies and where I find that they are interesting and also sometimes different, the perceptions of just transition. And very often you can also understand it once you understand where they're coming from, who introduced these terminologies, whom are they targeting, who are the constituency basically that they are speaking on behalf of. And something that coming from the global North, maybe if you could show my slide also, please. I would start off basically with the two short, basically, definitions, so to speak, as we're still in a kind of partly academic background. I just want to use the chance to basically look at these different kind of definitions of people, how they would have framed just transition. And the first slide, basically, from my side, basically is referring to the International Labour Organization. The International Labour Organization speaks on behalf of unions, on behalf of workers. However, we also have to understand that this is mostly speaking of the formal sector of workers. So these are people who are organized within a union, and this is not so much including the informal sector. So therefore, their understanding of the International Labour Organization, I'm still waiting for the slide to go up, sorry for that. So I will read it out in a second, basically, how the International Labour Organization is interpreting it. And then I want to compare it to an understanding from just transition, which has been developed in South Africa, actually, with respect to the just transition framework that has been developed in a co-developing process from many different stakeholders on the ground, academics, as well as participants from the communities, on the local level, and just to basically highlight that there's different perceptions of what just transition could mean, not saying from my side which is right or which is wrong, and I will leave it also to people from the other panel basically to describe it and how far they agree with these framings or not. So just wanting to read out basically the definition by the just transition by the International Labour Organization. They refer to it as a just transition means greening the economy in a way that is as fair and inclusive as possible to everyone concerned, creating decent work opportunities and leaving no one behind. So there's a very strong focus on labor because they are labor unions, so therefore this is their terminology. They understand this as such that a just transition involves maximizing the social and economic opportunities of climate action while minimizing and carefully managing any challenges, including through effective social dialogue among all groups impacted and respect for fundamental labor principles and rights. Ensuring a just transition is important for all countries at all levels of development. It is also important for all economic sectors, by no means limited to energy supply, and in urban and rural areas alike. So this is the terminology used by the International Labour Organization, and the International Labour Organization often claims that the terminology just transition is originating from them, and that they came up with this the first time. And from my own understanding and experience, we have seen that the terminology of just transition is very often also used as an excuse to slow down the transition process from fossil fuels to other energy carriers, to slow down something because they say we have to think about the people. However, they're not speaking about all the people, but mostly of the people that are working as direct workforce, which are their constituency. From my understanding, I would say that the understanding of a just transition as developed in the just transition framework by the South African community and people within a co-developing process is more inclusive. And within their framework, they basically put it as such. A just transition aims to achieve a quality life for all South Africans in the context of increasing the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate, fostering climate resilience, and reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 in line with best available science. A just transition contributes to the goals of decent work for all, social inclusion, and the eradication of poverty. A just transition puts people at the center of decision-making, especially those most impacted, the poor, women, people with disabilities, and the youth, empowering and equipping them for new opportunities for the future. A just transition builds the resilience of the economy and people through affordable, decentralized, diversely owned renewable energy system, conservation of natural resources, equitable access of water resources, an environment that is not harmful to one's health and well-being, and sustainable, equitable, inclusive land use for all, especially for the most vulnerable. So this is a definition where most people that I've spoken to in South Africa say that they identify with this because they feel included. And I think it's a bit more broader because it especially targets those people which will be hit the most by the transition that we have at the moment, and who in many cases are already being hit at the moment by all existing inequalities that we have in the different countries. They still also focus a lot on this transition from fossil fuels and coal in the respect of South Africa to renewables, but they also mention natural resources, they also mention water, so it's not only limited to people and work. So therefore, these are just like two basically different perceptions, I would say, by maybe a bit more global north, International Labour Organization, focusing on worker, a more inclusive, bottom-up developed with society together, more inclusive, I would say, definition for just transition. And therefore, I think I would leave it with this from my side. So we'll basically hand over to Eduardo Gudynas to basically have the floor to share his respectable knowledge and expertise on just transitions within this field, with especially expertise coming from the Latin American continent, basically speaking now to the world, so to speak. So basically, I think if we have his slides coming up, and then I will directly hand over to you for around 10 minutes input. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Bien, buenos días. Cambiamos al castellano.
Thank you and good morning. We'll now switch over to Spanish. Is that okay? Great. I was only given 10 minutes to speak, so I'm afraid I'll have to cut to the chase. And I'd like to present 10 points to you. These could easily be controversial. I'm not expecting to convince anyone, but these are 10 controversial points with regard to transitions. Very well. Next slide. The first point is that transitions are of an urgent nature. And within said urgency, when seen from the global south, and specifically from Latin America, and specifically from South America, we cannot wait for the global north. We cannot wait for a consensus on positions with regard to transition among countries from the north, in quotes, especially focused on industrialized nations, because it's our urgency. We also cannot wait for a global consensus. This is not something I have time to support now, but for example, waiting for a global consensus that combines China, South Africa, India, etc., we cannot wait for that in Latin America. We must enable our own transitions. And the second point is a warning with the idea of that which is global. Global, in quote, has some positive aspects, but it also comes with some negative aspects because it reinforces subordination to transition agenda that are sourced from the global north. That could be political in nature. For example, the Green Pact from the UN speaks to just transitions. And this Green Pact imposes a trade agreement on Chile for energy reconversion in Europe. But it's also a north when referring to the academic sector, which plays a very important role in reproducing conventional strategies for development and the production of alternatives that are also a part of that global north. Therefore, I now pass on to the third point. There is a history of transitions in Latin America, and more specifically that which has to do with natural resources, and that is now seen when we speak of energy and climate change, that have been around for at least 15 years. It began in the Andean and Amazonic countries, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru, and especially in these first two, with the reconversion of the progressive administrations. This conversation was very powerful, and there are some positive and negative aspects and lessons that can be learned. But there has been some amnesia. We have forgotten our own history. For example, here in Colombia, there is a debate with regard to transition coming from the current government as well as from civil society, where many stakeholders forget the history of their neighboring countries. For example, Bolivia has 15 years of history of its government and its opposition and civil society organizations discussing how to have a tax reform. So we cannot forget our own history. And I believe that in many cases it's more sophisticated and has made more progress than the discussion debate from the global North, the academic global North specifically in English. And the second point is that the transitions for Latin America have specificities. For example, I agree with the one that you just read, correct? But with regard to the specificities of Latin America, it's missing. I will mention some of the things that are specific to Latin America. Latin America has a subordinate insertion as a provider of natural resources. Its net physical loss is 100 million tons per year in natural resources without considering the ecological impacts. These are enormous, brutal impacts in volume of natural resources, as well as territorial impacts and displacement, and disimproved living conditions and social conditions, as well as the negative impact on national economies. Another specificity, for example, with regard to climate change, is that our main emissions come from changes in land use, deforestation, and agriculture. Therefore, if a transition focuses only on climate change and energy, given said condition of the impact it has in rural areas and on the forest, would involve an agrarian reform discussion. It's more important to discuss agricultural policies than what we do with electric vehicles. Do not worry yourself with electric vehicles. What I am saying here is that it's even more important to reconsider the strategy for livestock farming and agriculture and forestry. And the third point of that specificity in Latin America is that it's intercultural. There are indigenous peoples that have cultures and worldviews that belong to them that lead to political changes and social changes and cultural changes in how to come up with alternatives. So this brings us to the fifth point, which is having our own way of thinking. In my opinion, our alternatives and transitions require having our own thinking, our own thought processes. I will now share a few headlines with you. If I take this idea of sustainability as a commitment in these transitions, if it's taken seriously, then it involves escaping the ideas of development from developed societies, because it requires breaking with ideas such as economic growth or perpetual growth. And in a parallel fashion, real sustainability includes different valuation frameworks that has consequences such as recognizing the rights of nature. Therefore, these conditions present the need of escaping conventional development notions. The second point is that transitions are a pathway, but they are not the final destination. They are not the final destination. So another thing that concerns me is the enormous effort, noteworthy effort made in debating these transition pathways, but it's not clear where we're headed. And this where we're headed is specific to Latin America, given the specificities that I mentioned. Thus, an organization on transitions would be inseparable from discussing and analyzing that final destination. Another complex point is that transitions themselves are complex. Simplified transitions could be good to attract people to a campaign or advocacy measures, but transitions themselves require considering a different kind of state and how to organize, for example, taxation and the fiscal system. What might be the strategies for agricultural development and livestock farming? What would be the foreign trade policies in place? What could be sold abroad and what couldn't? what are the consumption patterns specific to each country. Thus, transitions are complex. Simplification, which of course I use sometimes, we want to transition towards Buen Vivir or well-being for all. That's great, but it's not enough. And it's not enough because if we wish to convince more people to join us on these transitions, we must provide them with more content. So this complexity must be discussed and dealt with. The next point is that transitions are democratic. And if they are democratic, any vertical imposed process is not compatible with the desire that is a founding block to transitions. This includes having, of course, mechanisms for citizen consultation and sharing information publicly. This is a very important point we must consider, especially when considering other continents that are under authoritarian governments. And finally, transitions are a political commitment. They are, but they cannot be resolved by party-specific efforts. Independence is necessary. Independence from political parties. This does not mean that I criticize or stand against adherence to enthusiasm or the disappointment of many people with their political party. What I'm trying to warn you of is that transitions must occur independent to the electoral processes of senators and local administrators. And this is specific to Latin America because every time that these transitions have been co-opted by a political party, the end result has not been desirable. So it's a political debate, but it's broader and it's more independent, and we must be careful with this. Thank you very much.
Eduardo, thank you very much for these great words, basically from your perception, so to speak more from a Latin American behalf. I'm very glad and honored now to hand over to Wangũi Kamuni, and I think she's working for an organization called From the Roots, which she can explain much better what the context is about. And I think she understands herself more as a regeneration practitioner, and her work is motivated by the question of how to heal the colonial trauma that comes along with the past and present, and how to get regeneration practices to basically heal these processes. So therefore, I think it's great to have you here, basically in Santa Marta, and the floor is yours.
English. Good morning, everyone. My name is Wangũi Kamonji. I come from East Africa. I'd like to just start by honoring and acknowledging my lands and waters, where I'm from in Katarungai in East Africa, and the people, my ancestors, and all my people who support me and enable me to be here, including my spirit guides and the earth. I'd like to invite us to just open with a practice of noticing and acknowledging also. We're good? Noticing and acknowledging all of our people who accompanies you here. Who is your support system? Who are the people who uplift you? What are your commitments? Who are your communities? Acknowledging also the lands and waters that have received us here in Santa Marta. I invite you to notice your contact with the seat beneath you and how that also grounds you into the earth, holding you. And let's take a collective deep breath. Okay. My computer has decided to restart. A very long breath. Okay, I think I'll have to start without the computer. Yeah, I'm gonna have very specific things I want to say. All right. Don't count this in my time, please.
The time is stopped.
Okay. Wow. No. Okay, there it is. It's restarting. Cool. In any case, I'll maybe. We're like waiting with things and breath.
But you add the minutes afterwards.
Yeah. Okay. So, I want to speak about coloniality. I want to speak about regeneration and transitions from coloniality to regeneration, and what pathways to a pluriverse imply, what transitions imply, or what transitions require of us. I'll start by just giving maybe definitions of coloniality. Coloniality refers to the continued shapes and patterns and processes and structures that remain and continue to persist even after the end of quote unquote flag independence or the end of administrative colonialism. And so together with this, I also want to say that I'm speaking from a context that's informed by African histories. I'm speaking from knowledge that has come from conversations, both with whole self and with whole community. So earth, ancestors, the divine, as well as humans. And so I think of coloniality as a kind of static, or I sometimes like to say static, to refer to the state, freezing of shapes and processes and structures that persists and continues to exist in our lives today. And I think of regeneration as an antidote to coloniality. I could say more about coloniality, but I don't have my notes. 97% complete. This is hilarious. Yeah. Okay. So I define regeneration as a combination of four things. I define regeneration, and I think of regeneration from the context of a place that has been colonized, and in this way bring an often neutralized ecological term, regeneration, into conversation with oppression and with the necessary liberation from oppression. And so I define regeneration as individuals and communities enacting their agency, enacting their sovereignty, which is one thing, one ingredient, in order to engage actions that prevent death, that heal dis-ease, and that add life to all members in community. But what do we need in order to actually engage regeneration? And here I also want to just mention that I use the word regeneration. I understand it's an English word. It's a kind of unwieldy ecological word, but I use it to almost to encompass all the different ways in which different African communities or different indigenous communities have had ways of speaking about how they tend to life, and have had values, life philosophies, or you can even call them communal desires that point towards how we tend to life. So I'll give you two examples. One example from East Africa is amongst the Agikuyu, the highest or most important life value or life philosophy is Tayo. And this means peace, and it means kind of integrated or holistic peace. So peace within oneself, peace between people, peace within communities. And peace amongst between humans and the earth, and also most critically importantly, peace between those who are still living on this earth and those who are deceased, peace between humans and ancestors. Another example from Southern Africa is from the Tswana community. A life value is Ibuhle, which means beauty. And in this case, the imperative to generate beauty, where beauty refers to relatedness and beauty refers to there's a better word than order, but I'm going to say order now. Order, or things being in their place, things doing the thing that they came to the world to do. One moment. The computer woke up. I'll give a third example from a pastoral community amongst the Fula of a life value or a life philosophy, Rara Tuburi, which means move towards the better or search for the better. And this coming from a pastoral community is often referring to nomadic pastoralists are always in move to find better pastures for their livestock, for their cattle. And so okay, so these examples have to indicate how particular like named life philosophies from different communities contain these 4 ingredients that I named earlier, having the individual and communal agency to engage in actions that prevent death, heal disease, and add life. And so to break those down a little bit, preventing death implies maintaining the communion amongst humans, ecologies, and spirits, and ensuring the basic needs of for life are met. Healing disease implies intervening for repair in moments of deflection from these named philosophies, values, and goals. And adding life implies increasing the quantity and quality of interrelationships amongst humans, ecologies, and spirits. But how do we arrive to regeneration, to restoring our capacity to embody our sovereignty, prevent death, heal disease, and add life? And as no. Okay. As Eduardo mentioned, like transitions or moving from coloniality to regeneration, they're exactly that, they're a movement. And one that invites, in the context of coloniality, engaging cycles of healing and cycles of creation in order to unfreeze the static regimes of colonialism and create new possibilities in community. Another way that I define colonialism often is the process of one world eating other possible worlds, to use a common African metaphor of eating. Camilo, no. Okay. So our understanding and recognition of historical, intergenerational, and ongoing trauma has increased in the recent past, and we're finding and rediscovering tools and creating new tools to deal with trauma. I want to pause here and just ask, like, how many of us have ever been hurt physically? You've ever been hurt or wounded physically? Just raise hands. Oh, y'all are very safe people. You don't get hurt. Oh, that was the translation, yeah? Okay. And I want to ask, when you underwent the healing process in your body, was it immediate? Was it quick? Did it happen like this? Was it painless? Okay, so I didn't think so. And so healing isn't often quick or within our timelines and desires for comfort and easy. And what's more, when it comes to social, emotional, mental healing, we tend to resist healing processes. And we resist in particular the metabolizing stage of healing processes, which require kind of collapsing and a reckoning with painful realities. And that resistance tends to reinscribe and accentuate the pain on our own bodies as humans, as well as on more than human bodies. And it continues to derail and delay transformation. And so, in short, like, we are afraid that the falling open that is implied in healing processes will be the same as the falling apart that happened in moments of trauma. And in resisting, we prolong the trauma and recreate the trauma. But transitions are desperately needed. So what do we do? The framework that I work with is called the From the Roots framework. And this is a final piece of my invocation. This model proposes that being deeply grounded in the roots of core, calling, community, and cycles, while we engage healing and creating processes, will support us to divest from coloniality and practice regeneration. Said differently, for us to divest from coloniality and live and practice regeneration, we must engage processes of healing and processes of creating. But to have the willingness and the stamina to engage healing and creating sustainably and with grace, we need to be deeply rooted in core, calling, community, and cycles. These 4 roots create the necessary containers for us to feel safe enough to fall open without fearing that we are falling apart and disintegrating. They make it safe enough that we resist less and for shorter periods of time, each time we're confronted with our own commitments to coloniality. And because transitions imply loss, and all loss is accompanied by grief, these 4 roots hold us and witness us through our grief and enable us to relinquish our commitments to coloniality with greater ease. I want to just mention what these roots are, not to just like name them and leave it there. And so as I just like briefly describe each of the roots, I want you to reflect on yourself and consider, like, how are each of these roots for me? Do they exist to begin with? Are they healthy? Are they deep? Are they wide? So the root, I'll start with the widest one, the root of cycles. This implies re-embedding into and attuning into cosmic and earth rhythms of changing seasons and cycles. And these are also the seasons and cycles that all beings, projects, creations, and so on go through. The root of calling is the root of becoming, exploring and coming to know the gifts that we came into this world to deliver, and responding with purpose, engaging our responsibility to meaningfully participate in the world. This is a feature of many Indigenous African lifeways, that is valuing each human life and viewing each person as being in the world for a life-giving purpose. And if this is a central tenet, then it presupposes the care that one offers to life in order that that purpose may be realized, which is the other root, which is of community, the root of care and belonging, which invites us into healthy relational practice and practicing right relationships with ourselves in our one-to-one and group relationships, with earth relations, with all embodied beings with whom we share earth, with ancestors, spirit guides, the divine, all that. And then the last root, which is the root of core, which implies being, self self-knowledge, self-awareness, self-relating, and coming into relationship with the wholeness of who we are as spirit, body, heart, and mind. And coming into awareness of our value, our belonging, and safety as unshakable and unquestionable. So rerouting ourselves in each of these four roots begins our processes of remembering, or in Spanish, remembración, remembering self and community wholeness so that we can courageously face reality, heal, and create to move towards a vision of the pluriverse, a world in which many worlds fit. So I'm closing now. I invite you to notice your body again and notice where what you had landed for you. And feel free to take a final collective deep breath. Thank you. Thank you for bearing with the computer.
Thank you very much, Wangũi, and full understanding for that. So therefore, I would like to kick off the discussions by basically posing one question to each of the presenters first, and then afterwards I will be opening the floor. So you can already start to think if you have some questions that you want to raise in Spanish or in English to one or to maybe both presenters, and then we will afterwards take a couple of them. And maybe let me start with Eduardo, basically having heard now from Wangũi, basically her perspectives, which come more from an African continent and is basically inspired by the origin of her descendants and the roots, literally. And so therefore, I wanted to ask you, in how far do you find similarities from her perspectives compared to your experiences, which are more inspired by the Latin American continent and its knowledge? So in how far do you see similarities or maybe also differences that you would like to share with the audience?
Bien. Hay tanto similaridades.
Very well. There are similarities as well as differences. But these differences are part of a framework that make them similar as well. For example, I'd say that a key component when discussing transitions has to do with, depending on the various countries and regions, with escaping a colonial condition, a post-colonial component, so to speak. And in the case of Latin America, it would be expressed as breaking with on their decolonial independence, because you could say that we have been independent since mid-19th century, but there has been an imitation, a subordination as far as ideas and cultures and understanding of development. The second aspect has to do with the fact that there are multiple ways or forms of rupture or ways to explore alternatives to understanding development in various continents and regions. This applies to Europe as well, or North America as well. But thinking and analyzing development and the way in which modernity is organized are constantly blocked, impeded, and they're usually described or classified as folk expressions, or the expression of an indigenous people, or a new age form of expression. So they are constantly silenced and annulled, and this has practical consequences. In our countries, for our environmental impact evaluations, these other ways of understanding nature are just an appendix done by anthropologists when studying environmental impact, with little or no impact on the decision-making process, both financial and political, as far as what should be done with a mountain or a river, say. That is just one of many possible examples. Having said this, I'd like to add something else. Breaking with these conditions also requires that we rethink and demand changes within local communities themselves and civil society organizations themselves. And I believe a good example can be found in the Buen Vivir conversations in South America, that are not only the expression of a mix. There is a mix of indigenous and non-indigenous worldviews, but also for civil society organizations, it includes learning and changes. There's one clear example, which is breaking with and abandoning the machista patriarchy in many organizations in rural areas, indigenous peoples, and marginal neighborhoods. So learning is for everyone. Popular knowledge is not equal to a transition toward paradise. We all need to learn in this process. How's my time going? I can speak as long as I want. Okay, I've been censored. What I find key in all these changes is a threshold of other ways to see or understand values. So when there's an understanding of values that go beyond the utilitarian side of things and seeing people as utilitarian and goal, potential number of hours of X employee in our factory, or potential profit that can be received by the cashier at the supermarket, which is equal to the interpretation of the river, mountain, or forest as the profit that can be obtained and the corresponding market value. So when we break with that utilitarian and anthropocentric appraisal and understanding, and we accept the intrinsic, independent understandings of the use it has for human beings and nature, I'd say this is the change in mindset that opens up new ways to explore transitions toward effective sustainability.
Thank you very much. So also about some people have started writing. I think people are going around collecting cards, basically, where you can write your questions, and then I will basically condense them and then ask the questions. Seeing that there are already lots of questions coming in, I think it's great. It also means that we might not be able to fill all the questions, but then I think there will be time for bilateral talks afterwards with people. So I think this is okay. I would basically, knowing that Wangũi also prepared one additional picture that she wanted to show with us, I think it would be great if we could show it on the screens. And then I would ask you with my question to you and how far you could basically reflect from your perspective also and your experiences that you've had now in Latin America as you've been traveling a bit in Colombia, and how far you would share also some of the things that basically Eduardo just mentioned, or if there are some differences from your perception, from your awareness on the ground here in Colombia, as well as from your international experiences that you have globally, may also finding the link to the picture that you want to show and then elaborating on this would be great. Thank you.
I think I would want to underscore a few of the things that Eduardo already mentioned, which is about specificities, that you have to think transitions from the particular locations and the particular contexts within which those transitions need to happen. And also the piece about we need to think our own transitions, creating or articulating this from the roots model was basically arose for me out of a tiredness, a frustration with just how much the continent of Africa was often left out of conversations about sustainability, about ecological knowledge, also about indigenous knowledge, and arose from this desire to articulate something that would take into consideration the particular context of having been colonized, the particular context of indigenous knowledges, indigenous peoples, even though they might not be legally recognized as such, that inhabit the whole continent and the rich diversity of peoples, cultures, life philosophies, life ways that honor the earth. And so that for sure. And, you know, along with that, I would say, you know, traveling in India and kind of learning about a bit of the history of the Green Revolution, one of the things that struck me was, and especially in this time when there are efforts to export the Green Revolution to Africa, very, very concerted efforts to do this, was the idea that you cannot export sovereignty. you cannot export agency. The idea of development that comes from outside is a myth and a lie. And so that as well, I would absolutely underscore from what Eduardo shared with us, that we have to think our own processes of development, our own processes of transition, and we have to reclaim and re-embody our sovereignty, our agency as individuals and communities. And in my context, when I think of regeneration, I'm also naming that as a beyond state value, that the state is one of the institutions that robs agency from everybody, including the earth daily. And so these are beyond state values that we're naming. I will just name, oh, okay, the image is up. Okay, I'll just say one small thing about that image. That is what I was talking about. And the thing that I want to say about that is that it looks beautiful and elegant and easy, but then you have to do it. And that's where it becomes hard. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I will start to read out some of the questions that I've gotten, and some of the questions have already partly been answered. So I will, in some cases, focus on some of the things that are more new, basically, to the discussion entirely. And I still encourage others to write on more questions that they have more. So the first question that I will read, they are always directed to the two of you together. So I will read a couple of questions, and then I will first hand over the microphone to Eduardo, and then to you, to Wangũi, to pick on the different elements. And I think they are very connected because it's a similar topic. So therefore, and it's not yes or no question. So therefore, it's a bit on you also to decide what you want to focus on, I think. So the first very simple question is, can we identify a universal set of ethical criteria for the pluriverse? And is it not maybe also a contradiction to find a universal set? So therefore, it's like provocative. So do you have a solution, so to speak? Then another thing is focusing a bit more on the just transition and these definitions of energy also in some case. And from your perspective, what does a transition look like in a territory that was exploited over 30 years, in some cases, of course, even more than 30 years, within human rights violations, etc.? And are the just transitions maybe just a strategy of global marketing? Which is maybe referring a bit to some of the things you just mentioned, but you could elaborate on this. So yeah, so I will first leave it with these, and maybe if you could have very relatively brief answers, then we have time for the additional questions that we just received. So if not.
Bien. O sea, ¿quieren que en un minuto conteste la posibilidad de valores éticos universales?
They want me to answer whether it's possible to have universal ethic values in the pluriverse in a matter of a minute. What I will say is an incomplete and perhaps mistaken answer, and then I will have to deny having ever said it. But I believe it's important to distinguish in practical terms the difference between ethics and morality. Ethics has to do with what we consider values, how they are defined and conceived. And morality is what's right and wrong. And based on this, I could define a universal ethics which has to do with the defense of life. And at the same time, accept the plurality of understanding that there will be various moralities on how to decide what's right or wrong for them. Why? Because someone who works in agriculture is also taking advantage of nature, but clearly with a different intensity and purpose as a large agribusiness company. Let's consider gender. I can see the elder here. We have spoken of the pluriverse to justify a patriarchal vertical relationship in other societies and continents, reaching the point of female mutilation. Now, there is a tension, a trap, you could say, because the plurality of cultures could also be reused and taken advantage of to impose authoritarian views. But on the other hand, we can also not impose a set of Western values on other cultures. So one way to escape these tensions is to distinguish between ethics and morality. Taking a step further, would it be right, fair, and correct to say everything that helps to preserve life and nature? And then within each culture and country, they could resolve and achieve this in their own way. And I'm afraid I can't answer anything else in a minute.
I will touch briefly on the second question, even though I think it's coming from a very particular context. But what I want to say about it is that that question was also referring to the common, we know of this, the cooptation of terms that come up constantly that seem like, okay, this is a nice new term that we have now. Sustainability suffered that. Regeneration might suffer that. Just transitions might suffer that. And that that seemingly radical terms emerge and then are quickly co-opted into the purposes of, I would call, coloniality, or into the purposes of the same dominant system. And I would say for that is why, like, it's not just a question of finding and naming what these radical philosophies are. It's not just a question of saying, okay, now regeneration is what we're going to do. No, it's actually, or you know, finding and naming even radical African life philosophies. It's not a question of just having those names. It's a question of orienting ourselves, anchoring ourselves in those values and philosophies, and orienting our movements, orienting our life towards those values and philosophies. And often that is what is missing, and that is how these terms get quickly co-opted, and especially by institutions like the university, like the media, and quickly get de-toothed, de-radicalized. And yeah, maybe that's what I'll say to that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'll take the next round of questions, and we maybe change the order. And so I would first come with a specific question to each one of you. The one to you, Wangũi, is basically, how does the African continent see the transition in Latin America? Because I think you are one of the few people who basically even knows this language, is currently also having the privilege to travel. So basically coming from the African continent, is there any kind of perception about how things are happening in Latin America? And do you think, also knowing some of the things here on the ground in Latin America, do you think that it's a truth perception of what is happening on the ground, or is there also some wrong perceptions, or do you maybe also see possibilities for more closer cooperation between the different continents, given certain similar struggles?
So yeah, just keep it there so that I can keep seeing it. I think it's actually on purpose that Africa and Abya-Yala do not know as much about each other as they could. Speaking from my own experience, I did not learn about South America in growing up in Kenya. And that's what I've heard also from this context, that largely the education system here focuses on Europe or on the US and does not talk about Africa. And I would say that this is on purpose. Yeah, it's on purpose to disable and weaken possible solidarity that could grow from peoples who have so much shared history. And I happened to learn Spanish when I was in university because I chose to, but also, and more importantly, I learned Latin American history. And I was surprised to find so many similarities between our histories, only that most of those similarities were separated by a few centuries. Colonization happened here way before it happened on the continent of Africa. However, the processes were so similar, and it helped to open my eyes to understand even deeper my own history. And so I would say at the moment, there are movements towards building more South-South dialogues, and in particular between Africa and South America. And we need translation, we need language accessibility for that. Spanish, Portuguese, very few countries that on the continent of Africa, English, French, very few countries in South America speak that. And there are efforts towards that. I'll just name one. The South Decolonial Feminist Collective has been running exchanges, dialogues over the last 1 year, bringing together scholars from both Africa and Latin America and beyond, I think also from India, into conversation with each other and supporting that, resourcing that, providing the translation to enable that, mutual understanding. And then also, with for example, the global tapestry of alternatives or, new networks that are emerging like ecoversities that are really, really supporting that ability for peoples from these two continents to meet, to have dialogues, to share life experiences, to talk about our histories, and to see just how much there is in common and to learn from each other, to be inspired by each other's processes, to be inspired by each other's strength. Yeah, that's what I'll say.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Building a bit on this, also to you, Eduardo, there's the question how to build independent solutions or how to build independent transitions in Latin America when there's a very strong dependence on the global north, financially especially, or dependence maybe on countries as well as companies. So therefore, how far, is there a possibility to be more independent?
Bien, gracias por la pregunta. Insisto que el primer
Thank you for
paso
the question. I'd like to insist that the first step is developing our own thinking processes. Latin America's dependence on exporting natural resources, financial dependence, etc., and of course, external responsibilities that go back for many, many years, as well as internal responsibilities, because there are many political actors and corporate leaders that reinforce and reproduce this dependence relationship. So rethinking and coming up with our own solutions is of great importance. I'm in Colombia, so there's something I must mention, and especially for the younger ones present. Fax Borda, Colombian sociologist, insisted on the idea of Rizal thinking. And in his case, he referred to a political outlet. But the way he saw the culture and history is an important precondition. Another two I want to add to this change in perspective is Astalinao Zuleta. I think it's important to reread his essays on difficulty, because this has to do with transitions. And Zuleta has another text that says, Colombians dream of change. This comes from the previous century, if I'm not mistaken. Colombians dream of change, or you could say they dream of alternatives. But Zuleta says, in his classical grouchy old man way, but they're dreaming in a mistaken fashion. And this leads to cultural, political decisions, violence, etc. So we must also open the door to self-criticism. And I would like to mention someone else from his same time, Mario Arubla, who wrote an essay in the 70s on Colombia's subdevelopment. So it's an independent, critical view of the strategies for development in Colombia. So it is not my job to give you a recipe on how to escape the situation, but I would like to say that these authors in this Latin American tradition are leading the way for self-thought and an independent way of thinking. And a lot of this has been forgotten. So it's easier to quote the Italian, British, American author. And everyone wants to save capitalism following Mazzucato's recipe. And they meet at Nariño's house with Petro. And it's published in our newspapers and media. But if you read her alternative, it has to do with saving capitalism from itself. is a reform within capitalistic development projects. And if you read about transitions, I insist they are complex. Transitions are not simple. If you read everything that Mariana Mazzucato says, for example, look at her plan for transitions in Chile, which could shed light on the situation in Colombia. CEPAL hires a British, Italian, American economist to explain to Latin America what alternatives they have available to them. So the document for the countries in Latin America, the example given with support from the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, that in Chile, the plan of alternative could be to conduct more mining operations, to have more money for the next step in the chain of copper processing and chilling. That is her alternative plan. If I present that transition alternative plan under the lens of Zuleta or Faxborda, it's more of the same. It is not a real alternative. So this critical thinking depends on ourselves alone.
Thank you very much. So I will continue with, first of all, some questions to Wangũi and then some to Eduardo again. There have been a couple of questions. I'll read them out and then leave it to you to combine them or also focus on some of the maybe individual responses in case there's not enough time, so to speak. So I will start with a question that was partly answered already by you. It was the question of how far does Africa face similar challenges or similar situation, like Latin America when doing this transition, like the words of getting rid of extractivism, what is the role of informality within the different sectors, so to speak, and how far is the similarities? And from your experience, how did the communities in Africa have resisted and re-existed within the African continent? So to share some experiences there, to maybe learn in Latin America from Africa's positive or negative examples also. And last but not least, a question to you, but also afterwards to Eduardo, basically more the question to trying to find a solution, basically, like, is there a possibility to decentralize the transition to the communities, like to give it back to them? And therefore, might this be the way? And is this something that people in Africa are already trying, at least some communities? Handing over to you first.
Similarities, yes, that's all I'll say. Communities, I'll just give two examples, and I'm sure more of my colleagues here, Michelle, Claire also can give many more examples of communities that are resisting, and in particular, I think for me, what's important is not just resisting. In the model of movement ecology that comes from INI Institute and also elaborated by Lea Penniman, there's like 4 different kinds of ways to exist in movement. You can resist, you can reform, you can create alternatives, and you can also be working to do the healing work, yeah? And I think the communities that inspire me are not just resisting, they are also declaring and living, doing the prefigurative work of living those alternatives in the present. I will give just 2 examples. One comes from Morocco, which is a whole community that was in resistance to the amount of water that was being extracted to go and serve a silver mine. And for me, this is inspiring because it wasn't just a few people, it was a whole community. And they set up a water camp. It actually lasted way longer than the No Dapple protest in the US, the Dakota Access Pipeline. Standing Rock, thank you. I was looking for that other word. This encampment lasted longer than the No Dapple, but as I said earlier, people don't often listen to or know about what's going on the African continent, and then we also have language translation difficulties. And so it's not a very well-known example, but it was a whole community, and in encampment, living their alternative politics in the now to protect water. Another example from South Africa comes from the Pondo community and the ways in which they have been resisting an Australian mining company trying to, I think they're mining titanium or something, they're trying to mine titanium. And I often propose like an idea of regenerative justice that is not just using the same avenues of retributive and distributive justice, but moving into restorative and generative justice, meaning proposing alternatives, but also integrating healing. This is what the community in Pondoland have been doing. Yes, they have pursued like legal avenues to block this mining company, but they've also been going like door to door, house to house, school to school, to talk with the people of the community and share what is the proposal for that actually honors life that they are wanting instead of this mining company. What are the agroecological alternatives that they're proposing? What is it that they actually want to do instead of just opening the doors to this mining company? So I'll just give those two examples, and yeah, with those, just to say that it's not just about resisting, but actually proposing something that is in line with tending to and ensuring the care and continuation of all life. And then the last one, yes. Do you think there is a possibility to decentralize transition to communities? In my opinion, I think it's communities that are the ones who need to be leading the transition, waiting on the state, waiting on institutions, waiting on, I don't know who else we wait on, but whoever else we're waiting on, it doesn't work. We have to reclaim our own agency and our own sovereignty as individuals and in community to lead the transitions, because our own bodies, these transitions are not, I didn't say this in the presentation, but we can't think our way into transitions, to regeneration. It can't be a mental exercise alone. It can't be an intellectual exercise. It has to be embodied. It has to involve our hearts and our spirits, our whole selves. And so absolutely, I think it's not just a possibility for me, it is the way, it is the requirement that as communities, we take the reins of our own transition processes.
Great, thank you very much. And I think handing over directly to Eduardo, I think there's one question that was partly answered from an African perspective, like this decentralization as a solution, basically going back to the communities, if you agree on her aspects or find other additional points to mention. And then the second question would be more that energy transitions do not seem to be interested that much in including indigenous cosmovision. And how can this conversion be more inclusive, including other knowledges and other ways of being? So how do we basically...
Bien, los componentes locales y
Very well.
descentralizados son
Decentralized and local components. It says we're out of time. 10 minutes. Local experiences and the decentralized aspect plays a very important role because they're also the source for examples that demonstrate that this can be done. Having said so, I'd like to take a step further. In my opinion, the transitions that we need, given the urgency that we cannot continue waiting, require entire countries coming up with a Colombia that is post-mining. There might be some local solutions, but we need to also rethink and consider how the state will be reorganized, what public expenditure will look like to allow for a transformation of productive sectors. So, given the urgency of the current crisis and the fact that we cannot wait for Washington, Brussels, Peking, and Moscow to reach an agreement, because if we continue to wait, we'll continue to be trapped in the same situation. So we must rethink at an entire country level, because additionally, the way we depend on foreign trade requires not isolating ourselves from globalization, but being selective. So I'm referring to recovering sovereignty and autonomy to be able to decide what aspects of globalization we want to be involved in and how we want to be involved in it. So, for example, if I want to enjoy the Rolling Stones music, which is a part of globalization, then that's acceptable, I believe. But to continue exporting coal from Cerrejón for the European Union, well, I don't think that is a part of globalization I want to be involved in. So it involves selective isolation from globalization. And this is done at a state or government level. And from this starting point, other measures for transition could be established. So why are there no national prior consultation processes for the transition that foreign trade policies should consider at a country level? Because this plays a very important role. Now, moving on to the topic of energy, I'm going to go beyond energy, and I'm going to speak of extractivism more generally, and it could be linked with mining or fossil fuels. So one of the urgent matters that requires a transition is abandoning gold mining, because it has social and environmental impacts that are dramatic, regardless of how it's done. But the situation is so grave that in Peru and Ecuador and Bolivia, there are indigenous peoples that announce that there is a gold deposit as a way to defend themselves from external agents. And I understand, but then they themselves are trapped within gold mining extractivism. In Peru and Ecuador, there are indigenous peoples that have been fractured because a part of them accepts an agreement with oil companies, whereas other members of the community don't, even families that have been divided. So local tensions are also profound, and there is no magic fix, because there is also a harsh debate at a local level. So we need to move this debate forward to be able to reach the right solutions.
Perfect. Thank you very much for these inspirations. And I think it was very valuable to have these different insights, basically from both of your knowledge and expertise from different countries and origins, as well as disciplines. And I think what we can take away, especially from this session, was that it's a very complex topic. There's no simple answers how to do this, not on either of the different countries or continents, but for each community, even we have to see within the community. I think we need all people. What we've also learned is that we need to work together and to form allies, to learn from one another, to talk to one another, to be humble, to listen to ourselves, to our descendants, and then to try jointly together to fight for a solution, because it's worth and it's the only choice that we have. So therefore, I would like to also thank our online audience. I would like to thank the translators for enabling this session. And I know that both of the speakers will be here the rest of the day. So if you have additional questions that have not been fully answered because you want this solution for things, then feel free to approach them directly afterwards, also throughout the day. And therefore, I would like to thank the audience. I would like to thank the questions and everybody who enabled this. And let's give it up with a big round of applause for the end of the session. Thank you very much. Okay, so basically now the session ends, and basically goodbye to the online participants, and we will now directly continue with the next session. So basically those of you that have